Welcome to the October Chicago JavaScript Meetup. We're so happy to have you here. We have a special guest speaker this evening. His name is Kunz.
All right. Almost an equal amount of time in software engineering, in product development, product leadership roles, and in user experience. And for me, the common thread that kind of weaves between all of those is I'm really passionate about creating software for humans. And I'm passionate about all those different aspects. That makes me a little bit unusual, but I took that interest and passion and actually started my own company a couple of years ago called Zenthropic, with the tagline Software for Humans, really to explore some different startup ideas, but also sometimes you need to pay the bills. So to do some consulting, got some early traction, but wound up putting some startup ideas, at least for now, on the shelf, as I had an opportunity come out of my radar to work for a startup called Trading Strategy. That's a European-based crypto startup, as I think Heather already mentioned, or one of you guys, just building out a next generation trading protocol for crypto decentralized markets. And they were already building their application. One of the key co-founders and sort of technical leader for the startup was already enthralled with Svelte and SvelteKit. Found them actually through the Svelte Jobs Discord channel and did a 1-month short-term project that turned into a long-term gig. So that's what I'm doing full-time now, is the lead for the front end on Trading Strategy. I'm also the creator and maintainer of a library that's called Svelte FSM, which, if you're familiar with finite state machines, is a kind of a lightweight finite state machine library that's optimized for Svelte. That's a little bit about me. This picture is what you get when, see if I can remember my prompt here, when you ask DALL-E for a video game artwork of a man on an epic quest to find the perfect JavaScript framework with the Chicago skyline in the background. So, I mentioned that I've worked in Chicago tech for 20 years. My experience with JavaScript is also, 20 plus years. It was sort of the language that I cut teeth on in many ways. And when I started using JavaScript, it was nothing like JavaScript today. We didn't have Node, sort of server-side JavaScript, and the client-side implementations. There was a lot that was missing from the language. There were a lot of pain points with the language, but it was still amazingly powerful in what you could do in the front end. But it was very frustrating and challenging to have to deal with the, sort of wide chasm of incompatibilities between Netscape Navigator, and you think IE 11 is bad, try IE 6. So, it was great to see sort of the evolution of frameworks over time. I was an early member of the Rails community in Chicago and sort of early adopter of Rails, and was using like Prototype and Scriptaculous frameworks back when those were sort of the go-to approach to JavaScript within Rails apps. Like the rest of the world, sort of jumped on the jQuery bandwagon as jQuery gained steam. Have had the opportunity since then to use Backbone.js with Underscore, or a little bit with Ember.js. Ultimately was really excited to see the sort of evolution and revolution that React meant, right? Like to have a more declarative component-based approach that really dealt with what for me had been a lot of the pain points of some of those other frameworks and data flow as well. At the same time, there were things about React that frustrated me. Even as like React made the trans hooks and more function-based components, and I could see the rationale as the like React maintainers explained the transition. There were also just things I didn't love about hooks. I mean, the syntax can be fairly confusing at times. And I always had this sense that we were sort of re-implementing core language features in a way, in terms of how you manage state and how you, how you deal with data flow. So when I discovered Svelte and saw this kind of fresh take on that really tries to leverage core language features in a unique way, it really resonated with me. It really clicked. And so for me, you'll hear it in my presentation today. I'm definitely what you could call a Svelte fanboy. The philosophy of the language and the maintainers really resonates with me. And I've just found it really has served me well in the projects that I've used it on over the last year and a half. All right, so we're gonna do a quick little survey. And by the way, the Svelte community has this, sort of awkward habit of trying to insert SV in strange places in like existing words. So, forgive me for the annoying header to this slide, but take a minute and fill out this poll, and results are showing for everybody, or we just show them at the end. But it'll be just fun to see kind of where people stand in sort of the expertise or experience level here. All right, I'm guessing most people have probably answered. And is that already visible to everybody?
Still the 500 for today. We have some people in the chat asking. So I just wanted to throw that out there for anybody that may be confused.
I'm getting a weird feedback loop there.
Yeah.
Uh-oh. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Yeah, can everybody see, anybody want to throw a thumbs up if you can see the polls?
Yeah, okay, great. I just
Thanks, guys.
I wasn't sure if it was just visible to hosts or if that was visible to everybody. So we have almost kind of a bell curve here. Maybe if I'd have given 5 options, we'd have had a bell curve, right? But a lot of people, I think that, preponderance of responders here have heard of Svelte, would love to try it out. A few of you on the what the Svelte side, and maybe about equal if you combine the last two of people who've checked out the tutorial, tinkered a little bit, or you use it regularly. So, but this actually helps me to know as we go through some of the rest of the presentation, just kind of where people are on the spectrum of Svelte awareness. And so if most of you haven't gone through the tutorial, I'll be making sure that I tailor the content to that level as well. We can end the poll. And I'm just going to click stop sharing to get that out of the way. All right. Let's actually just spend a minute. I call this slide Svelte cred, like looking a little bit of the credibility of the framework in terms of, its growth and the awareness of it within the broader community. We'll look at some survey results from others. I don't know how many of you guys tend to follow like the State of JS survey, but if you look at it from the last 3 years, you'll see that Svelte is, at or near the top in the last 3 years on rankings for front-end frameworks. And I think, it's right here behind Solid in 2021, but, if we look at the rounding, they're both at 90%. So I'm calling it tied for first, even in this most recent Svelte survey. And this is on retention. So these are, the people that say that they would continue using or would want to use it again after having used it, something along those lines. Yeah, would use it again. If we look at interest, we also see Svelte for the last 3 years, topping out the charts on interest. Usage, of course, it's not going to be at the same level as like the big 3 framework. Certainly is doing better than any of the others in terms of growth, right? And you obviously see some things like Ember in decline, but Svelte has grown quite a bit over the last 3 years in usage, and again, grown quite a bit in terms of awareness. What's kind of cool is that it's not just in the front-end frameworks, but if we look at both Svelte and then SvelteKit, which I'll talk more about the difference, but briefly, SvelteKit is more like a Next.js type framework, if you're familiar with that from the React world. So that's categorized as a backend framework. It's really kind of both. And so we can see SvelteKit actually topping out 2021 in terms of retention and interest. Obviously, it's going to be way lower on usage, but fairly impressive that it's even as high as it is, given that Svelte is not even SvelteKit is not even 1.0 at this point, and I'll talk more about that later. And in awareness, so it's fun to look at those stats. Another big sort of survey that's done in the developer world every year is, of course, the Stack Overflow developer survey. We are unfortunately behind Phoenix, which I guess the entire Elixir community has probably one framework for web development, so they all have to pile onto that one. But this has to do with basically how sort of loved or hated. And Svelte is certainly among the JavaScript frameworks at the top, and this is the kind of thing that too, as as frameworks evolve over time, and as more people start to use it, the earlier adopters are definitely going to be those that are self-selecting in, right, are interested in it and enjoying it. And so you're going to tend to see over time, as frameworks gain more traction, more people start to have to use it because they were told to by their boss or because it's already being used on a project. And then you might see those metrics shift a little bit, but Svelte's still a little bit early in that life cycle. But I think a lot of this, reflects the genuine love and passion that people that use it have for it in the community. Just looking at, a couple other vanity metrics, on NPM trends, got some pretty impressive year-over-year growth in terms of Svelte downloads, in the sort of doubling every year category. And, of course, it looks fairly impressive until you click on React, at which point Svelte becomes a rounding error. So I did, try to do some fuzzy math on this, and I decided that I think Svelte is probably going to overtake React somewhere around the year 2097. So if we look at, Svelte's kind of credibility in terms of its usage in industry, this is, I'm sure, actually pretty outdated at this point, but this is right on the svelte.dev homepage. Some of the companies that we know are sort of using Svelte for real life projects, in production. I know, for example, on the sort of media company side of things, like a couple people from Bloomberg, from several other media companies spoke at Svelte Summit in September. There's a bunch of different European media companies like Der Spiegel in Germany and many others. So, Svelte got its start, sort of Svelte's origins were in the newsroom of the New York Times. And because of its performance and its utility in areas like data visualization, it gets a lot of usage in sort of those domains. So I know there's a lot of companies missing from this list, but it certainly is gaining more and more traction and use in the corporate world. Svelte actually has its own documentary. I'm not going to play that much of this, but.
And what is Svelte?
I love it.
Honestly, this framework has blown my mind.
It's the only JavaScript framework that's actually enjoyable to use.
Svelte.
Svelte.
SvelteKit.
Svelte.
So I won't play that much more of it. A little preview there, but after the virtual summit a year ago in September timeframe, a bunch of people sort of did a watch party in New York City, and that's when I think they filmed a bunch of this. And this came out maybe 4 or 5 months ago. It's a fun, relatively short watch, about 30 minutes. If you're interested in Svelte, I encourage you to check it out. You might have noticed Scott Talinsky listens to the Syntax podcast or has checked out any of the Level Up tutorials that he's pretty well known for. He's a big Svelte evangelist. And, I think an important aspect of sort of Svelte's credibility is also something that has maybe held Svelte back a little bit in terms of credibility or uptake in industry. And this is something that there was a pretty important milestone that was set at the Svelte Summit in September in Stockholm last year. So I'm going to play just a brief clip from the live stream recording from that. This is Rich Harris, the creator of Svelte, sort of giving his final keynote.
Where's Austin? That comment about the beta is like a dagger to the heart, man. It's fair. We have been promising SvelteKit for a long time, and one of the loudest pieces of feedback that we hear is we want a stable version. Like people are raring to use this thing, but you got to convince your coworkers and your bosses and whatever that this is not going to be a decision that you'll regret. And so we very much want to get a stable release out. And so today we are announcing SvelteKit is in its release candidate phase.
So look, we're a small, intimate community. It wasn't thousands and thousands of people. It was a couple hundred in a single track, one conference room conference over in Stockholm. But it was a fun, exciting moment to be there with this sort of fanfare around. I think a lot of people were hoping that there might be like a 1.0 announcement, but at least this release candidate announcement. Looking at the survey that we ran here, and a lot of people, maybe are curious about Svelte but haven't tried it. And in one sense, you're sort of lucky because, I lead the front-end development on a live production application with, thousands of daily users, and have had to go through the pain of the lack of stability in SvelteKit's API. And there was a huge amount of breaking API changes over the like 2 months or so leading up to the summit. So in a way, you're coming in at a really great time where you have a stable release candidate version of SvelteKit. If you want to play with it, you could start to build something, and you can know that you might see some new features come along or some bug fixes, but you're not going to see breaking changes to the API. So this is just, to try to establish a little bit of where Svelte is within its sort of life cycle as a framework, and that, it has a lot of credibility. If you're thinking about checking it out, you're not wasting your time. There's a growing community of users. There's a great, Discord community, and you're going to start to find other people that are coding in Svelte. So speaking of coding in Svelte, I think we've been probably almost to presentation without actually getting to some coding. So we are going to do some live coding. If I could spell. And actually, I'm going to use this as a moment too to just evangelize a little bit the benefits of Svelte's both documentation and their REPL. A lot of people outside the Svelte community agree that Svelte's documentation is what you could really think of as like the gold standard of technical documentation. So if you go to the homepage and you go to docs, you've got this, actually the tutorial, you've got this phenomenal, highly interactive tutorial where at every step, as you're learning the core concepts of the framework, you're implementing it and experiencing and experimenting with it as you go. And then the built-in REPL that you get here, you'll see constantly, say in the Discord, people, trying to answer a question, either ask a question or answer a question by sharing a link to a REPL example. And it's just great. It's really powerful. And it also even helps you understand the language in the framework because of how it can show you like the JavaScript, CSS, AST output. So, so I was trying to think of something really kind of creative and original that I could do in a coding example here. And what I came up with, I'm pretty sure this has never been done before. We're going to try to code a to-do app. I don't know that anybody's ever done that, especially, in any kind of a live coding example. I feel like at some point, like aliens are going to discover the remains of human civilization, and they're going to finally be able to decipher like the internet archives of data that they find. And they're like, what was with the developers' obsession with to-do apps, right? But I did try to think of something like more Chicago specific, like some APIs that are available for like Art Institute or the CTA or something. And either it was too complicated or it just didn't like showcase core features of the language. So I guess the reason that to-do apps are so like popular for these kind of demos is just because they really showcase like certain core aspects of building front-end apps quickly. So when you go to the Svelte REPL, this is what you see to start with, is just a super simple hello world. So we don't need this, we're going to delete it. And I'm going to intentionally actually create my to-dos component as a separate component that I can import into my app. So, whoops. I'll call this to-dos Svelte. So you can basically create multiple files in your REPL. If you connect your GitHub account, you can hit Command S and save as you go. And let's go ahead and import to-dos. The downside to coding in the REPL here is I don't have all the like IDE like autocomplete goodness. So I might be a little bit slower, but that to sort of showcase the REPL. So, so then let's just throw in a to-do component. And you'll notice that, and I'm seeing cannot access the file system. There's something wrong with my import for some reason here. I'm just going to refresh this page because this seems weird that that's not working. Import to-dos.
You're missing an S on the component.
I'm missing, down here. Thank you. Jump in and help me out if I have stupid typos. So thank you, whoever did that. Okay, it's still not loading for some reason. So import to-dos. /to-dos. This is just my luck. I'm going to go to a saved version and see if there's just something really stupid that I'm doing. This version looks fine. So I'm going to delete this file because, of course, I did this first as an experiment. And of course, it worked then. Okay, so we have a to-dos component. We should be able to import it. I'm not seeing the error now. I don't know. Notice, by the way, that we can import just this empty file and it works because this is technically a valid Svelte component. It's just rendering an empty string. So any Svelte component can basically have kind of three main parts. You can have a single script tag. Technically, it can have two script tags because you can have what's called a module context script tag. And then it can have some HTML. We'll throw in just a glorious BR tag for now. And then you can have a style tag where you're going to put your CSS. And you can think of the HTML here as equivalent to what you're returning from your React functional component or your render function in a React class-based component. You can think of your script tag as basically the JS context of either your function component or sort of both your method context and your constructor context from a classical component in React. React doesn't have an equivalent to like an embedded style tag because React is pretty agnostic about CSS, and to me this is one of the big benefits of Svelte is you get scoped CSS in your components for free, and it really works great. I think common challenges with CSS, so it's kind of really nice to have this sort of opinionated, built-in, straightforward way to handle your CSS. So let's start building out this to-dos component. First thing is we're going to need a collection of to-dos. And the way that you do that in Svelte is just, to define something that is going to have state is just to define a local variable. And I'm just going to make my collection an array. Let's go ahead and throw in a single to-do to start with, just so that we have something that I can render. And I'm going to make I guess the sort of domain model for the to-dos, I'll make them have an ID and then a value. So let's make this just to-do -1. I'll change the format of that, and we'll make this a little bit meta. So, and again, I think we're already importing this and rendering it. So let's actually start to do something with our state by iterating. So to me, it seems like a use case where I'd probably want an ordered or maybe an ordered list, which isn't spelled OR. List items. So what we're going to do is use sort of a handlebars-esque syntax here and say each to-dos as to-do. Close that, and then anything I put inside of here is going to sort of iterate over and render each of those to-dos. We can also destructure this. So since I know that my to-dos have an ID and a value, I'm just going to destructure that to use inside of here. And then we'll throw in a list item. For now, we'll just throw in the to-do in the list item. Nope, value. There we go. All right. So now you can see our one to-do is being shown on the screen. Not particularly useful yet, but it's a start. This looks pretty ugly, so let's just style it a little bit. Got an ordered list here that we want to have no padding and no list style type. And let's throw in maybe just a border on our list items. Let's see. maybe a little border radius. And we'll see, that's hopefully good enough for now. We can always tweak the styling a little bit later. This isn't a CSS lesson. So obviously a big thing we need to be able to do with to-dos is add them. So to do that, I think we'll want an input, right? In React, you would, let's see, you would have probably a variable that's holding your state. You would set the value of your input to that variable. And then, you might have like an on-change handler. Svelte has two-way binding. So let's go ahead and have a variable here. Maybe we'll call it new to do. We'll just default it to an empty string. And now I can just say bind value is equal to new to do. And well, we'll see in a minute what we can do with that. We could throw a button in here for being able to like add a to do, but I kind of like the simplicity of a UI where you just hit enter since there's only one field here. If you have a form with only one input in it, hitting enter actually submits the form. That could be a little dangerous. Sort of lost my page context. Let me just refresh here. Hopefully I had saved that. And so we actually don't want to submit the form in the traditional sense, at least in this use case. But I'm going to throw in an onSubmit handler here, just because I got that nice free feature of hitting enter submitting. And actually we can throw in a little modifier to a handler and say prevent default. And I don't even need to actually call prevent default in my handler now. And then let's just do add to do, which is a function I haven't yet defined. So I'm getting an error. So we can just define a local function in the context of our script tag here. And what do we want to do? Well, we want to add to the array of to-dos that we have with this new to-do. There's a number of ways you can do that. I'm going to choose a sort of a particular style of how I do that, but I'll explain why in a bit, because there are a couple of particularities of how you update state with Svelte that you need to pay some attention to. So I'm going to say to-dos is equal to, like I push on to the end of to-dos if you're thinking sort of typical idiomatic JavaScript, but there's a reason we're not doing that. So what do I want to push on? Well, I want to push on something with an ID. Might be overkill here, but I'm going to use crypto random UID. And then we'll push on the value. And actually, I'm going to do a little refactor here. Let's rename this to value. Of course, then down here, I need to bind this to value. And the benefit of that is because these two, because the attribute that I'm binding to here matches the name of my variable, I can actually just use a nice little shorthand syntax. And why isn't that working? Binding value, let value. Sorry, I just refreshed this.
Think you need the curly braces there on
Oh.
value?
You're right. Thank you. Is that Brittany?
Yeah. Hey.
You're live pair programming with me, catching my bugs for me. Thank you. Brittany, by the way, I'll mention or introduce her later maybe, but she's, a active member of the Svelte community. She was one of our MCs at Svelte Summit over in Stockholm, and is one of the kind of co-leaders of a group around inclusion and in the Svelte community. So thanks, Brittany, for being able to join. All right, and for helping me debug my app. So let's see what we've got here. So again, a nice little refactor, because then I can just reference value without curly braces here. And then of course I can use a shorthand syntax here as well. So in theory now, I think that's probably enough to say, oh, except add to do should be reassigning to do's, not to do. And we want to keep the to-dos that we already had. So we're just going to use our array destructuring syntax here and say, hello world. And look at that. We've got another to do. And now that seeing that we have two of them makes it look a little ugly. So let's say something like that. Of course, every time I change something in the code, it's rendering. So I may stay there, but you get the idea. All right, so we can add a to do now. And we add the ability. That's probably as far as strength of this demo. So to delete a to do, I probably need some kind of control or button inside of my list item here. I'm going to do that with a button. We'll just give that an X and an on click handler. Now in this case, I can't just pass a function name because I need to give it like what specific to do are we deleting. So I want to pass an argument. So I'll just put an anonymous, arrow function in here and say delete to do, which is a function that doesn't yet exist, but with a particular ID, right? Which is the ID that we have destructured here in our iterator. All right, so let's add that function. This expects an ID. And so now we ought to be able to pull that one out of our list of to-dos. Again, there's a few different ways you can do that are, sort of preference, but different idiomatic ways within JavaScript. Again, I'll talk in a minute about why I'm using the way I am, but I'm going to say to-dos is equal to to-dos.filter. And what are we filtering? Let's see. Again, we want to destructure. Let's see. I'm going to rename this. I'm not going to destructure. I'm just going to say ID here. We're getting a to do, and we'll say if to do ID is not equal to ID, then go ahead and delete it. That should leave us the to dos that we care about. Ooh, I forgot to do one thing here when we add a to do, which is we should really clear our value. I could spend some time obviously optimizing this CSS, sliding this button over to the right. We won't do that right now, again, just for the sake of time. But at this point, I can delete my to-dos, and we have a very basic but working to-do app. One of the reasons that I wanted to demonstrate earlier, kind of breaking this out into its own component, is let's see what happens if we want to maybe have multiple to-do apps within our sort of main component here that's loading it. And actually, I'll save that exercise for later if there's time. Maybe get back to the meat of the presentation, sort of stay conscious on time, so I make sure I can cover some of the other items. But if there's time, we can come back to that, and I could demonstrate some other features of Svelte, including like being able to use the same kind of binding approach, two-way bindings, not just with sort of native HTML elements, but even with like your own components. But for now, I want to highlight a couple of sort of things that we did here or decisions that I made that if you're coming from a React world or maybe a different framework, may have at least been a little bit confusing, or you're not sure why I chose to do it that way. First, in something like React, let's say you're using functional hooks-based components, then you need to use something like use state, or your classical component set state. In Svelte, you just set local variables and you update those local variables. Now, when you're dealing with a collection of some kind, an array or an object, if you just operate on methods of your array or object, there's nothing to tell the Svelte compiler that that state needs to be updated and sort of invalidated and reactively sort of update the dependency reactive graph of your application. And so the way that the Svelte compiler does know that that needs to happen, the way you would do it in React is by calling set state, or set on whatever your setter is from your hook. The way that Svelte knows through assignment. So you can't just do like todos.push and expect that to work. And since push doesn't return the array, I think it returns the length. It's not as convenient to say, you can't say like todos equals to-do.push. You could call push and then basically reassign to-dos to itself afterwards. To me, that's a little ugly, and I like this pattern a little bit better. I think it's probably a little bit more common of an idiom in the Svelte world. But again, if you're just like assigning a primitive value like a string or a number, assignment is what triggers reactivity. Similarly here in deleting, we have to use a method that's reassigning to the original array if we want to sort of trigger that reactivity. If we want to be able to, let's say, expose to-dos not just like internally here within this component, but make it a prop effectively that could be used outside or passed in, then all you really have to do in Svelte is export it. That may seem a little strange because we're used to exporting objects or functions from our modules that are going to be sort of consumed and used outside. But in essence, that's what you're doing when you expose something as a prop. You're saying this can be used outside, even though you're passing it in as a param. So it's a little bit of a way of hacking the syntax of the language to get used to it as a Svelte developer. It starts to seem actually pretty natural. All right, we'll call it quits for now on this demo. But again, if there's time or if there's questions later, we can come back and either unpack that a little further or address any questions. Maybe I'll just pause now quick though and see, are there any like major like areas of confusion or wondering how or why did that work based on the demo? All right, we'll see if there's questions at the end, but we'll keep going here. So if you've done a lot of programming in React, then hopefully from that demo, you noticed some ways that Svelte is pretty similar to React. And I would say for myself and pretty much everyone I've talked to who's made a transition to or is using Svelte in addition to React, that they came to Svelte from React. In general, people find that transition to be pretty straightforward because conceptually there's so much that's similar, right? The idea of declarative reactive components, a component-based framework where you can build, reuse, and sort of compose components. Very similar between React and Svelte, and some of those patterns of how you might think in a larger scale about your application and the relationship between components. They really apply in pretty similar ways. There's some differences because of like two-way binding, and so some of the ways you handle data flow handlers is a little different, but there's a lot that's similar. So the core sort of philosophy and concepts are not that different. They both have an HTML-like template syntax, right? In React, that's JSX. I know technically React doesn't require JSX, and you can write, sort of component classes. I don't know anybody that does that. Pretty much everybody I know uses JSX, and you're compiling it into React components. So they both have a very similar like HTML-like template syntax. I find the ability to use conditionals, if blocks, each iterators, and a couple of the other sort of built-in language features of the Svelte templating language. I just find it a lot cleaner than sort of nested embedded iterators in like a JSX template. But that's a personal preference thing, and there's a lot of similarities there. They both have excellent support for TypeScript. If you're a TypeScript developer, you'll be blown away by how native it feels to be working in TypeScript with Svelte, and how much support there is, even in SvelteKit for like generated types as you're working across different files. And they both allow you to basically write your core application logic using, what I'm going to call vanilla-ish JavaScript. Vanilla-ish in the sense that, of course, React as a runtime framework, imposes a lot of on you in terms of how you deal with application state, how you deal with data flow. Svelte also imposes certain requirements on you. The slight difference there is that React does it strictly through sort of native JavaScript, and then a runtime API for the framework itself. Svelte has, of course, its own runtime API, but it also has a few things where it sort of slightly borrows from and repurposes certain syntactic elements from the language. So, there's a couple things if you're a total language purist that might bother you about what Svelte does. I'm a little bit less of a purist, and I find the convenience and benefits that come from Svelte's approach to outweigh any of those concerns. So that's where they're similar. Where are they different? Honestly, probably one of the biggest differences is that there's no virtual DOM in Svelte. And if you're used to React, you're used to thinking of the virtual DOM almost as a feature, right? Oh, it's this great thing. I think it's good to sort of step back and think about the fact that the virtual DOM isn't really a feature, it's really an implementation detail, right? The feature is that you want declarative, reactive, sort of component-based structure to your application, but you don't want, as you make those kind of declarative stateful changes and your state changes, and you want your view to change the whole view layer in like large globs at a time, because changing whole DOM subtrees at a time turns out to be very, very bad performance. So the feature is declarative components that have decent performance. And the implementation detail that React chooses to solve that feature is the virtual DOM, right? Svelte chooses a very, very different approach for multiple reasons. One is, it turns out that, the virtual DOM is paraded as, a performance benefit, but it's really largely performance overhead. It's just a lot better performance than replacing the entire DOM or entire DOM subtrees. But there's much higher performant ways of addressing that same problem. And Svelte's approach is actually that Svelte is a compiler. You might say Svelte code is compiled, but it's probably even more accurate just to say it's a compiler. So when you write the code that we were writing in this to-dos app, this has to be compiled server side before you can use it, which isn't that different from React. Again, most people are using JSX, maybe TypeScript. You have a compile step, but unlike React, you're not shipping a runtime framework at all to the browser, which actually makes the amount of code you ship to the browser usually quite a bit smaller with Svelte. What you're shipping to the browser is the compiled JavaScript that you get as a result of what the Svelte compiler does to the code on the left here. And what that turns your declarative code into is just very, very efficient imperative JavaScript that knows exactly what parts of your component hierarchy need to be updated based on a dependency graph, based on when you change a particular part of your state, right? And it's actually quite instructive to kind of modify parts of your Svelte REPL and then look at how that gets updated within the rendered or compiled code that you can see in terms of JS output, CSS, and your AST. So I encourage you to check that out if you're interested. The benefits of the fact that it doesn't have a virtual DOM and it's compiled are some major performance boosts compared to React. I'm not going to spend a lot of time digging into the details of those other than to say they're well documented. React has done a great job of making some improvements in these areas over the last several years, but you still have a lot of like language features that are sort of leaky abstractions to the performance challenges associated with React, like use memo and component should update. Those are there because the core team understands that you don't always want to let the Svelte runtime try to make the decisions about what aspect of your DOM tree needs to be updated. I've never had to use something similar to those types of optimization features in React in a Svelte app. It's just better from day one without any of those optimizations. You write and ship less code. I talked already about why you ship less code. You write less code because Svelte just tends to, like the style of the language is a lot less boilerplate than React. And so on average, you'll probably find that you have about 40% fewer lines of code. And that's not an end in itself per se, but less code because there's less boilerplate means sort of a smaller surface area to understand. And assigning a variable is a little easier to understand than, what did I name that setter in that particular use state call? And, using sort of a custom syntax for state management is what React provides. And then a final reason that I'd say Svelte and React are different also relates back to the fact that Svelte is compiled, is we call it a batteries included framework. So I don't know if anyone follows Swix, Sean Wang, who has, a pretty substantial presence online as a sort of a tech influencer, I guess I could call him. He's an early and very active member of the Svelte community, one of the founders of Svelte Society. He wrote a blog post about, one of the things he loves about Svelte being batteries included. So scoped styling being built in, we talked about. Built-in support for transitions, so you don't necessarily need something like Framer Motion. There's some pretty powerful capabilities built into Svelte. Animations, class and style and accessibility linting. All these things kind of come built in with Svelte, and you might think, well, there's a big cost to that, right? Like if I throw all that stuff in my framework, then I'm going to have this much bigger application runtime. But because Svelte is compiled and does a great job with Vite of doing tree shaking, you only ship to the browser any of those parts that you're using. And so it allows the framework to really take this more holistic approach and sort of give you all the things that you need, the batteries included, to build useful web applications that provide great user experience. Let me take a quick breath here, maybe a sip of my soda, and then we can shift gears a little bit to talk about SvelteKit. And I know I've gone over time, so are we all right? I'm getting close to the end.
No, you're great, Ken. We have till 6:30 technically on the schedule, so
yeah.
Whatever you got, and then
we
we can have
had,
time for
the
questions.
other speaker had to cancel, so sad to be missing out on that talk, but then you guys, are stuck listening to me for longer. So we talked a lot about SvelteKit, about Svelte and not about SvelteKit. And I'm going to spend a little less time on SvelteKit again, just, because of the amount of time that we have for this. But the best thing or the easiest way to understand what SvelteKit is that SvelteKit is to Svelte as Next.js is to React. So the ecosystem for any amount of time, you're at least familiar with Next.js, even if you haven't done, a ton of Next programming. And so if you have a pretty good understanding of where sort of Next fits in that ecosystem, then you kind of understand what SvelteKit is for Svelte. It is maintained by the exact same, maybe there's probably, some people that focus a lot more on SvelteKit and others on Svelte, but it's really the same core team of developers kind of trying to bring a unified philosophy to both frameworks. But Svelte's the component framework, SvelteKit is the application framework. So it is powered by Vite, which comes out of the Vue community, and Vite is amazing. And we have some people that are Vite core team members that are also part of the Svelte core team. And it makes everything that we do in Svelte and SvelteKit extremely fast, which is wonderful. It takes a similar approach to Next.js with the file system based routing, or routing, as we like to call it in the Svelte community. British as so you tend to hear it referred to as routing and your router. It has support for layouts with nested layouts and some advanced layout matching capabilities, SSR, SSG, hydration, hybrid rendering strategies, all built in, really in a way like very transparent, makes it very easy to build a high performant app that is great in terms of your search engine optimization and serving devices that don't have JavaScript enabled, but then can have wonderful progressive enhancement or great experiences with extremely fast like client-side routing and client-based experiences. So sort of a very like best of both worlds framework. I want to just sort of mention briefly. So, again, if there were more time or if there's questions, I can show a little bit of a demo or an example of a SvelteKit application. This presentation itself is a SvelteKit application, and I will share that with Heather, and they can, share that later, and anybody can take a look at it. Just don't shame me, because this is the kind of code that you write when you're furiously trying to finish a presentation. It's not well refactored, beautiful code, but it was sort of enough to just, make the presentation in SvelteKit. But yeah, Svelte has some values. Actually, the first time I saw this list of values was when Rich Harris shared them at his keynote in Stockholm, and maybe they exist somewhere else on our website somewhere and I hadn't seen them. But inclusiveness, accessibility, resilience, progressive enhancement, egalitarianism, optimism, and importantly, fun. I would say I've really seen these values. So none of these values were a surprise to me when I saw Rich Harris put them up on a screen, because they seem very consistent with my experience within the Svelte community. And I mentioned to Brittany earlier, just 30 and talk a little bit about Svelte, or a core part of.
Sorry, it was cutting out for me. Did you just ask me to say something?
Yeah, if you're up for it, just say 30 seconds about Svelte sirens and maybe some of the inclusiveness aspect of the Svelte community.
Well, I thought my camera was good. Oh, it's not on. That's probably why. So it might come on, it might not. Okay, there we go. So Svelte Sirens is a community within the Svelte community called, we call it the Svelte Society, but it's just a group basically. And the Svelte Siren specifically is for women and non-binary people. And then we have allies also that can join our stuff. And we do live streams and talks on Svelte and just help people learn, build, and teach about Svelte in the community and show support and have a safe place for them. I'm actually doing a talk tomorrow morning on the Svelte Society YouTube channel, and I'm going to be walking through learn.svelte.dev, which is similar to the tutorial that you were showing earlier. So
cool. Yeah, thanks for popping on, Brittany. Thanks for joining. Brittany is she's in the very, very far northeast suburb of Chicago called Holland, Michigan. So she's one time zone away and was gracious enough to join. So
thank you, Brittany. Really appreciate that.
So that's all I had in terms of my. I'm willing to, hang out, answer some questions, go back to the REPL if people are interested. This is actually a photo from the end of our summit, shortly after the fanfare of Rich Harris saying that we had a release candidate of pretty much everyone that was in attendance at the summit. So you get a sense of the size of the community relative to, say, a React conference. But yeah, that's it. Any questions?
Yeah, you guys can feel free to unmute yourself and ask Ken any questions. And yeah, Luca, I agree. Round of applause for Ken. That was, incredible. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to. And hopefully I didn't miss anything major in the comments. I didn't have them open in the background here, so.
I don't think so. And Brittany was on those questions. So that was lovely that you had your backup.
Love that support. Thanks, Brittany.
I guess I wanted to ask just in general, kind of like what's next for Svelte? It seems like there's a lot of strong base and support behind it from that community. With SvelteKit and Svelte itself, like what's the plans going forward here?
Yeah, good question. And I don't want to pretend like I have the exact answer to that, but I'll go from memory from. We heard Rich or other core team members say, and then Brittany certainly jump in as well. I think it's worth noting, and I forgot to mention earlier, so unlike React, Svelte doesn't have corporate backing per se. It doesn't come out of a particular corporation. It was just Rich Harris developing it, certainly with the support of the fact that he was doing it in the New York Times newsroom. But a few months ago, he accepted a full-time job at Vercel, which is actually the creator of Next.js. Because there's so much that's philosophically aligned with what Vercel is doing and what we're trying to do with Svelte and SvelteKit. And so basically they pay Rich Harris and now one other core team member from Svelte to work on Svelte and SvelteKit full time. And so we've seen the pace of PRs and commits increase quite a bit. And we saw them get to that release candidate stage just before the Svelte Summit. And so in the short term, I think the focus is on getting to SvelteKit 1.0. There's a couple small ways in which it may not be feature complete, and then certainly like any bugs or performance issues that they need to deal with. So big focus on getting to 1.0 for SvelteKit. I think along with that, it's not, to be 1.0 in a framework is not just about like the code works and the features are there. It's also about the level and quality of the documentation and the other things that need to kind of come around it to make it sort of a whole product, if you will. And I mentioned earlier that Svelte's documentation is like Kit's documentation, and sort of the demo onboarding experience for SvelteKit. There's a lot of work going into that, but it's not like where Svelte is. Like Svelte is pretty mature as a component framework, and SvelteKit is still like pre 1.0. So I think a lot of energy and effort will be going there as well. And then I think once SvelteKit is 1.0, I think there may be some focus back on Svelte itself, like thinking about like Svelte 4 versus SvelteKit, 2. So what are some, next things that could be happening with the actual component framework? Brittany, any additional?
I was literally just saying that in the chat.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think we're on the same page. We are singing from the same hymn book that we probably heard it in Stockholm or in the Discord. So.
And then Jason had a question in the chat that said, how would you compare SvelteKit to something else targeted at shipping less code to the browser like Astro?
Sure. I haven't used Astro myself, so it's difficult for me to make a direct comparison. I guess what I will say is, the approach to Svelte, where you're basically, if you look at like the to-do that I wrote earlier, right? This looks really quite similar to if you were just to open up an editor and start coding like a single file web application or web page, right? Just a single file, single page web page, right? You'd have, of course, you'd have to wrap it with your HTML and head and body tags, but then you could throw in a script tag, and you could throw in your markup, and you could throw in your JavaScript. The problem is you can't like encapsulate pieces of that in that traditional fashion, right? So in a way, Svelte's approach gets us back to, sort of the simplicity of that style of programming, but where that would quickly become like a tangled spaghetti code monster, because you don't really have a clean way of extracting things and kind of keeping everything that belongs together, but keeping things that belong separate. What Svelte does is, without layering a lot of extra constraints or sort of new syntax or semantics on top of that, kind of lets you get back to that simple style of just writing, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, but having it be, encapsulated at the component level. And that makes it actually very sort of accessible to new people who maybe don't have as much programming experience. I think Svelte is a little bit easier to teach. I was actually going to be doing like a 1-week high school class, and we didn't get quite as much other teacher support to do it at a local high school here. But I was going to be using Svelte as a way of just teaching, sort of web technologies, raw simplicity of it. So, but I can't compare it to Astro. I don't know if somebody else could maybe.
I agree with all that. I was just going to say on Astro's side, I think the big difference is Astro focuses on that islands architecture. So that's a little bit different, where they can hydrate different components on the same page. Svelte doesn't do that. Svelte does it on a page, or SvelteKit does it on a page or routing basis, rather than on the same page, not hydrating components. Also, Astro, as of right now, is only static site generated or server side rendered. You can't do a hybrid like you can with SvelteKit right now. So those are maybe some of the big differences. And then Astro also, you can use any language. They have their own templating language, but then you can use Svelte, you can use React, you can use Vue inside of it. Solid. I think there's a few more too, but.
Yeah, thanks for adding that, Brittany. Yeah, that's a big difference, is that Svelte or SvelteKit is not intended, like from day one, it wasn't intended to be like just an SSR framework or just an SSG framework. It's really intended to be like a best of all three of those worlds framework, right? So if you have pages that are completely static, then you can just pre-render those, right? Essentially SSG. And if you have pages that anytime a page is being requested, by default, that's going to be server-side rendered, so you get that SEO benefit. But then by default, those pages are created with the JavaScript, so you get the sort of full dynamic nature of like a traditional single-page app. So you sort of get the best of all worlds with SvelteKit.
Nice. Thank you so much again. And I am going to quickly, does anybody else have any like last minute questions? We're always happy to hang out for a sec if you have any. Otherwise, I just kind of want to say again, thank you so much to Ken for his presentation. I mean, that was super thorough and awesome. And then just make some quick announcements about upcoming meetups. So we are going to be holding a meetup on November 15th. It's going to be virtual, so you can join us from anywhere, invite people. It's amazing. And we're always looking for speakers. So if anybody you're, working in a JavaScript framework that you want to share more about, or you're working on a project that's written primarily in JavaScript and you want to share that with us, really anything JavaScript related, we are game for it. So you can always email Noah or I, and I'm heather@batovi.com. So you can always just email us and we're happy to, talk it out and see if we can accommodate your talk. But thank you guys so much for joining us. We can hang out for another couple minutes if anybody has anything they, want to shout out or share. Otherwise, thank you guys so much and have a great night. And thank you again, Ken.
Hey, Ken, you said that was a SvelteKit app that you were using. Are you using something to do the slides in it, or was it just a page? And
I literally just rolled it from scratch in like the last day to turn this presentation into a SvelteKit app. So each slide is just a section, and I just applied some styling along with like scroll snap to the sections.
Nice.
Basically made each section, I think I made the whole thing a CSS grid and made each section, have 100 VH and 100%, 100 BW in terms of its sizing. And then the rest of it was just like I just made each slide its own component and then just imported each component. So I have a single page with like 10 components imported. I mean, it's kind of ugly code. I could show it if you guys want. Well, I'm gonna throw it up on GitHub and make sure that it's either, rendered out to a static site for GitHub pages or somewhere that it's easy to actually see the presentation as well. And you guys can have a field day poking fun at how bad the code is because I wrote it so fast. So
that's awesome. I'm doing my talk Monday called Starting with Svelte, which has a lot of similarities to yours, but maybe a little more towards the enterprise crowd. And I'm doing Google Slides right now, and now I want to build it in SvelteKit.
Feel free to steal any of the bad code that you want. So
okay, sounds good.
And that was a great question, James. Yes, I'm going to throw this link in the chat. You can always stay up to date with us at meetup.com/JS-Chai. So we're always going to be, looking for our next Ken, and November 15th is going to be our next meetup. So all of that will always be available there, and we'll update it as we go.
Well, I forgot to say at the beginning, so I'll at least throw it in at the end. Maybe I did say it, but I'll say it again. Thank you, Batovi. Thank you so much, Heather and Noah. Heather, you were amazing in terms of just all the advanced communication and coordination, sort of make it easy on me. And just for inviting me and allowing me to share about Svelte. So. Oh,
heck yes. We're happy to have you.
Yeah, 100%. It was that, like Heather said, it was extremely thorough. And, I seriously, I wish we had more time. If you have like, another advanced, more advanced Svelte you want to take, now that you gave us the intro, feel free to like come back and, present again. That was fantastic. Brittany, you as well, because I'm sure we already know that you got stuff ready to go too. So anytime. Thank you.
Brittany's done a bunch of these with the Svelte Sound. You can find a bunch of her presentations on the main Svelte YouTube channel. I'll also mention, just pitch it one last time. Like if this whet your appetite for Svelte, go to svelte.dev and just go into the tutorial. Give yourself an hour and you'll probably get through, most of it, depending on, especially if you're already familiar with React, maybe even less than that. It's interactive, it's easy, it's fun, and you will have a really good sense of Svelte in a pretty short amount of time. And then just like pick something that you want to try doing with it and open up the REPL and start playing with it, or start building a SvelteKit app, because that's pretty quick and easy as well. Just with a npm create svelte at latest, boom, you've got a great template to start with. You can look at sort of the demo template that you can create, or you can create like a minimal vanilla starter application really quickly with a generator from npm. So
do you think with all the changes and kind of confusion on the routing system now that it's going to be the default way to create a Svelte app?
Just using the npm create.
So I think the goal with SvelteKit was to have it be the one gold standard path of creating a new Svelte app.
Right. Yeah. There are times when you might not want or need everything that SvelteKit gives you, right? Especially if you're trying to maybe build components that you're pulling into an existing application that's not a from the ground up SvelteKit application. But I think the easiest way to get started to build anything, especially maybe you're not sure if something is going to be one page or it's going to grow into requiring multiple pages later, there's not really a downside to just starting with it as a SvelteKit app. Like, it just works so easily and kind of gives you, sort of the room to grow, if you will, if you're going to grow it into a larger application. So I think it's the best way to start.
I still don't like the syntax.
Oh, of the new routing system?
Yeah, so you have to have a plus prefixed in front of any route. So you have plus page.svelte and plus page dot either JSTS or like page.server for server side routes, which is, there's a lot of pluses and pages in my applications.
There was a lot of healthy debate in the community. So they kind of put out a, here's what we're planning to do. This is going to be a major set of breaking changes to the routing before we reach 1.0. And they invited comments from the community, and there weren't flame wars, but they got a lot of feedback, some positive, some negative, some of which caused them to, rethink certain aspects of the proposal. The proposal was definitely heavily influenced by like some big routing, I think, being worked on within Next.js. The fact that Rich works at Vercel now, I think there's a lot of kind of cross-pollination of ideas there. And I would say, though, I had to go through a major migration of an existing live production app to the new sort of routing API routing structure. And it takes a little bit of getting used to, but I think the benefits are like far outweigh the negatives. Like basically the short version is, besides what Brittany was saying about the like plus page, is that every route requires a directory. So you can't, in the past, you could have a route that was directory based, or you could have multiple pages that represented separate routes just as separate files under a single directory. And there were reasons that why you might do one or the other, and then why a single, file-based route might turn into a directory route. So you kind of had to refactor and move some files around. And they simplified it by just saying a new route requires a new directory and then a plus page JS or TS file inside of it. It takes a little bit of getting used to, but I think the benefits outweigh the negatives. But
I don't mind that change. That was actually good. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. We once again really appreciate your time. Really appreciate the presentation. Thank you, everybody that joined us today. As Heather said, we are always looking for speakers. Next meetup is planned for November 15th. Hopefully our previous speaker had to cancel. We are looking forward to having him back. So be ready for that, and we will see you guys next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye, guys.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
To learn more about ChicagoJS, visit our Meetup page linked in the description below. To learn more about Batovi, visit our website and blog, also linked in the description below. See you next time.